Welcome to Dave Talks Comics. I'm Dave, and this is my podcast where I talk about comic books, cartoons, and this time out it's going to be comic book conventions. This is episode 167. All past episodes of the podcast can be streamed or downloaded from the program's website, davetalkscomics.com. In addition to the website, this podcast can also be found on iTunes, Stitcher, and Facebook. You can find my notes on what I have read at davetalkscomics.net. So, as I hinted before, I'm going to be talking conventions this time. This is my fourth and final episode on Heroes Con 2019. Before I get to the meat of this episode, which is the recording I made on the third and final day of Heroes Con after the convention was over, after I had gotten back to my hotel room, I had a few notes on things that I think I mentioned in the other episodes about this year's Heroes Con. First, Cartoonist Kayfabe, they've released some more content related to Heroes Con. In particular, there's an episode where they talk about things they found, things they bought at Heroes Con. But they still have yet to, even though at this point it's almost a month after Heroes Con, it's basically about 4 weeks since Heroes Con, they have yet to release any of the videos of the panels from Heroes Con. I'm not sure what the story is. Hopefully at some point they will release those, because I really do want to see the ones that I didn't make it to. And maybe I'll even watch the one again, or watch the one that I went to. Another thing I don't think I mentioned during my previous recording was that on the first day of the convention, and I should have mentioned this in part 2, so that would have been episode 165, is that I saw Adam and Sean Doughty of the Dollar Bin. I saw them just before the Cartoonist Kayfabe panel. I stopped, I chatted with them a little bit. I know that Adam was doing recordings of the video and audio, I guess, recordings of the Kayfabe panels, including the one that I went to. So I saw them, I got to chat with them for about 5 minutes. I did not see them again later and during the show, but I usually see them when I come to Heroes Con, or I try to make a point of it, and sometimes I see them at the Small Press Expo in September. Another thing that I forgot to mention is that in episode 166 I talked about the panel, the sketch-off panel. I don't think that's what it was called, but it was something like that, where you had Paul Pelletier and Jose Luis Garcia Lopez and Lee Weeks drawing. And they drew these sketches, and then they gave everybody in the audience numbers, and they drew numbers, and they gave away the art that the artist had drawn during the panel. Well, I almost won one of those. And when I say almost, what I mean is the number that I had was one off from one of the numbers that was picked. And that was the number for the Paul Pelletier Wonder Woman sketch, which I would have loved to have won. I had number 110, number 109, the number that was drawn. I had this idea that if number 11 was called, I could flip it upside down and claim that I had the winning number, but they didn't call number 11. They called number 109. So I didn't get a chance to try that scam, and I don't know if I really would have. And the last thing I wanted to mention before I move on is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. This isn't really essential, but I mentioned 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea in episode 166 because I thought that it was something that I'd love to see Chris Schweitzer do a movie poster for. And I wasn't sure exactly when the movie came out. The movie that I'm thinking of came out in 1954, and that was with, I believe, Kirk Douglas and James Mason. And I think Peter Lorre was also in that. And I don't know if there was any other actors, but I did look it up since I recorded episode 166, and I wanted to mention that. So, without any further BS, here's my recording from Sunday of Heroes Con 2019. Today was the third day of Heroes Con, and it's over. Heroes Con 2019 is, I guess, in the books. I still have yet to do this recording of what I did on the third day, and I've couple things from day 2 to talk about as well. And I still have to put all this together and get it out. Hopefully by the end of the month I'll have at least a couple of these out, maybe all of them if I'm really lucky, but I'm not sure about that. So first, a couple things about yesterday, about last night. Since I recorded last, I hadn't gone to eat yet. I found a place that wasn't too far away. It was about 2/3, 3/4 of a mile from where I'm staying. I decided to walk there. Path wasn't very well lit, or at least in places it wasn't well lit. I started to wonder if maybe I should have just driven there instead of walking. But I don't know. I wanted to get a little bit of exercise. So I went for a walk. I got to the place. It was a Mexican place. I'm not big on Mexican food, but I had Asian food the night before. I was planning to have some barbecue on Sunday night tonight, and I didn't want either of those, and I didn't want fast food, and so this is where I ended up going. There were certainly closer places that I could have gone to. So I end up at this Mexican place. I guess my first indication that that this probably wasn't going to be a great place to go. It wasn't the sort of place that I wanted to go, at least. So when I got to the door, there was somebody there. There was a security guy there, and he asked, his first question out of his mouth was, "Are you here to eat or to drink?" So I told him I was there to eat, and then he insisted on patting me down. I mean, it went smoothly enough, but still, it should have been a huge red flag. But the thing is, I had walked there. I didn't feel like walking all the way. It was like a 15-minute walk there, something like that. There wasn't anywhere else that I can recall that was nearby. I think there was a gas station around the corner, and I probably could have gotten something to eat there. I mean, something pre-packaged to eat there and taken that back to the hotel and eaten that. But I went in. The music was incredibly loud. It was not very well lit. Obviously, it's a night spot at night, and it's a restaurant, I guess, during the day. I had a beer, and I had some enchiladas, and the food wasn't very tasty. I was a little concerned about it giving me indigestion, but it didn't. It didn't give me indigestion or any other sorts of complications that sometimes I get from some kinds of food. I wasn't crazy about it, but like I said, it went down easily enough. Well, I don't know. It felt fine. I didn't wake up in the middle of the night, like I said, feeling strange or anything. So after I ate, I came immediately back to the hotel, and I think I didn't do anything else really that night. I think I just went to bed. I got up in the morning. I, showered. I went downstairs. I ate breakfast again at the hotel. I did not go out like I think I said I was going to, or I was thinking about doing in the last recording on the last episode of the podcast. So I just ate at the hotel. I had something slightly different. I had a bagel. I had a couple of hard-boiled eggs. I had some cereal. I think that was, and a cup of juice. Of apple juice, and that was it. And it was decent. So I took care of a little bit of business. I had to do a little bit of work for my day job, and that took me maybe 45 minutes after I'd had breakfast. The other thing I did was after. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was after I had breakfast. I walked over to, there was a gas station nearby that had an ATM where I wouldn't be charged any fees. So I went over there, I used the ATM, I got some more cash, and I got a sandwich for today because I didn't want to have to leave the show. It just seemed a bit awkward to leave the show today considering the way things were scheduled. So I got a turkey sandwich from the gas station, and then I walked back. And then I did this little bit of work I had to do and brushed and flossed, and then I went to the show. I got to the show before it opened. I had to stand in line to wait to get into the show. I probably got there at 20 of 11. The show opened at 11. I had a rather amusing encounter with the security guard at the front because they were checking bags. I don't remember them checking bags in the past at the Charlotte Convention Center. Yesterday, I can't remember if I mentioned this or not, but yesterday, one of the guys who checked my bag, we did it very blasé. I had two bags. I had one I was carrying in my hand and one a messenger bag on my back. And I put down the bag that I have in my hand, and he looks at it and he says, "Okay, you're fine." You know, it was like he just gave it a glance, and then he was like, "Okay, you're fine." He didn't ask me to take the bag. He didn't ask to look at my bag that was on my back, and so I just moved on. Today, the lady was very polite, but she opens my bag, she sees the sandwich there, and she says, "You didn't bring me anything? There's just one sandwich here. Where's mine?" Which cracked me up. And I said something like, "I'm sorry, I forgot," or something like that, which I probably think is funnier than anybody listening to this will. But she also mistook, I carry around this portable stool, this folding stool, a camp stool with me, which is very useful, and I did use it today for an extended period of time towards the end of the day. And I have that in the bag that I carry in my hand. And she assumed it was some sort of weapon or something, you know, like these cosplayers bring in these weapons. And so she was like, "You're going to have to take that over there to that table over there." And I was thinking, what does she think that is? And then I explained to her that this was a seat. It was a stool. And she was like, oh, okay. I thought it was something else. So I got in line. The line wasn't super long, but there was probably a couple hundred people in line ahead of me. Eventually the show opened. I went downstairs. I walked around a bit. I looked for a few people that I'd talked to before. They seemed to be busy with other people. I ended up I looked for some comic books. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but I ended up browsing through a dealer's boxes. And this is a dealer that I think I've bought stuff from before, possibly here, possibly at the Baltimore Comic-Con, possibly at both. I didn't get the dealer's name. Maybe I can figure it out. I think it's the same dealer that I got that Manhunter trade paperback from it. I think it was Baltimore last year. And what makes me think of that is that they always have these $5 trade boxes. They have quite a bit of variety in there. It's not like all the standard DC and Marvel stuff. They have a lot of independent stuff. And it's also just the way it's set up, the way it looks. It definitely looks different from a lot of other dealers' setups. It's not just, they have like a big, they have the boxes on tables, and then they have like wall space set up where they have things like toys hanging on the walls. And I'm not sure which, like I said, I'm not sure where exactly they were on the floor. I know which side of the floor they were. Anyhow, so I bought 5 things from them. 4 of them were trades, and 1 was a mini-series that was, all 3 issues were in a bag. So in the order that I got these things, the first thing that I found, and like I said, I really wasn't looking for anything. I just happened across these things. So the first thing that I found was Volume 2 of Jack Staff. Now when I say Volume 2, I mean this is the first collection. Volume 1 was the collection that was originally printed in the UK from, I think it was Dancing Elephant Press or something like that. Volume 2 was printed through Image Comics here in the US. So this collects the first 5 issues, I believe, of the Image Comics run. I really love the original run of Jack Staff, which was 12 issues, and that everything, I think I've talked about it on the podcast, everything used to be in black and white, I believe is what it was called. In fact, let me open this up and see if I think it's in here. The previous, where is it? I thought I saw it in here. Or maybe it's when I looked online that I saw. Anyhow, I can't find it. But this is called Soldiers, and the tagline says, "This is the story of what happens next." Now, I notice it's not just by Paul Grist, it's also by Phil Elliott. Now, Phil Elliott does what in this book? Oh, he's the colorist. Okay. Now, one of my trepidations about reading the image run of Jack's Staff is that I really liked the black and white look of the original series. I really liked what Grist did with that. So I'm a little unsure about this, but for $5, basically $1 an issue, I figured why not. And I did find the 4th volume, but they didn't have the 3rd volume. And I think just buying the 2nd was enough for today anyway. The second thing I found is Johnny Hero. This is by Fred Chow. This is the collected edition of Johnny Hero. I bought one of the issues. I think it might have been the first issue, but I'm not sure of that, of Johnny Hero a number of years ago. I think at Heroes Con, probably one of the first Heroes Con, maybe even the first Heroes Con that I went to back in 2011. Either that one or in 2012, I think. And I enjoyed it. I enjoy Fred Chow's work. The other thing that I feel like I owe him for is he had a bunch of... The first time I met him was at... Possibly the only time I met him was at the Super Show in Reading, Pennsylvania. The Comic Geek Speak Super Show in 2010. And he had these boxes full of trades that he was selling for $5 a piece. And I think I bought like maybe 8 trades from him. And there was some really good stuff in there, including, I think there was a Hellboy in there. There was of the things that I bought, a Hellboy. There was a Milton Caniff's Mail Call, which was a strip that he did after he did Terry and the Pirates. Or no, I think he did it at the same time he was doing Terry and the Pirates. But right towards the end of his run on Terry and the Pirates, like right near the end of World War II, and then for a year or so after that. And it was like a monthly or something like that. So those were a couple of things, and I can't remember everything else that I bought from him. I'm sure I have a list somewhere on Reading for the Trade, my old comic books blog, if you want to go back there and look, or maybe I'll go back there and look at some point and see all the things that I got from Fred Chow. But he was a nice guy. I do like the look of his artwork. And so I'm just curious to see where this story goes. I'm not completely sold on the book. I mean, it seems like it's doing a lot of things. And I think he's gone into writing things that are more focused towards all ages or towards younger readers at this point. So this is something I don't think it's terribly adult, but I mean, it's not R-rated or anything like that, but I think it's more something that adults or adolescents would be more interested in, something they probably would not speak as much. It's a little more intelligent than probably the things that he's doing for younger audiences. Anyhow, the next thing I found was a mini-series called Luger. And this was from Eclipse Comics, and I wasn't too sure about getting this, so I looked it up on mycomicshop.com, which sometimes has really good descriptions of what the comic's about. And I like the description there. It kind of feels like a crime book from what I read. I actually have not taken it out of the plastic yet, but it's just 3 issues. It was $5, but the cover price was $1.75. So let's see. So 3 times $1.75 is what, $6.25, I think, something like that. No. Yes, I think it is $6.20. No, $5.25? I don't know. Anyhow, I got this basically for cover price, I believe. So I thought that was a reasonable deal. I like the look of the artwork, at least the artwork on the cover of the one issue that I was seeing. And like I said, I like the description in the comic book. I don't think I have very many Eclipse comics. I should look into that and see how many. I mean, Eclipse, I was not buying stuff from Eclipse, and I don't think that's because that I wouldn't have liked those comics. I think it's more a matter of me just not having exposure to them, not seeing them, or just overlooking them and being more blinded, more interested in DC and Marvel comics. I don't know. The next thing I found was the first trade collection of, this is a comic book called Skeleton Key. This is written and drawn by Andy Watson, who I have read a number of the things he's done. I think my favorite is still Love Fights, which was a 12-issue series that he did back, if it wasn't 20 years ago, it was probably close to it. And there are 2 trades that you can read, that you can find. I think they're out of print, but I think you can find them fairly easily. I did reread it in the past couple years, and I do have notes at DaveTalksComics.net on those 12 issues. And there's all sorts of neat, especially if you've read a lot of superhero comic books, there's a lot of references to things that will, and characters who sound very much like characters from either DC or Marvel, that kind of thing. But it's about 2 people who were in a world with 2 non-superhero people, kind of a romance, and they're in a world. One's a reporter and one's a comic book artist, and I don't know. I like it a lot. I'd say I think it's worth a read, especially if you like things that are a little humorous, and then take the superhero genre and kind of turn them on their side. Or turn it on its side, I guess. Yeah, turn. So I bought Skeleton. I'd heard about Skeleton Key, and I was kind of interested to try it. It's not like Love Fights. It has a supernatural angle to it, but there are a number of trade collections, and sometimes I think they can be pretty expensive. Let's see, there's at least 5 of them listed in the back of this one. This one is called Beyond the Threshold. And then there's 4 more of them. The Celestial Calendar, Telling Tales, Cats and Dogs, and Roots. So I'm curious to see what this is like. I'm hopeful. The artwork does not look, I think this is some of Andy Watson's earliest published work, and the artwork does not look quite the same as it does in some of his other stuff that I've read, like Love Fights or Slow News Day. Yeah, I mean, his stuff is not very action-oriented. I probably Love Fights is the most action-oriented of them. But let's see, on the back of this it says, Tamsin Mary Kate's boring high school existence is turned upside down when she accidentally obtains the Skeleton Key, an artifact that can open doors to anywhere. Liberated from her Canadian hometown, she becomes involved with a Japanese fox spirit, tea-drinking witches, and a closet monster. Can she cope with a typical teenage school life of parties, friends, bullies, and kung fu as well? So I was interested. I gave it a read. I gave it a read. I'm giving it a try. I'm going to read it. I'm interested in seeing what it's like. As I've said, Love Fights is my favorite thing that Andy Watson wrote. It's kind of like Darwin Cook. The first thing I've read of Darwin Cook's was DC, The New Frontier, and I loved it, and I've reread it, and I still love it, but I have yet to find anything in my mind that equals it in terms of total production. Darwin Cook's done some beautiful artwork on some other things, but nothing else I've read measures up to what he did with The New Frontier. The same, I feel, is true, probably to a lesser degree, with Love Fights. I really enjoyed Love Fights, and I've enjoyed some of Andy Watson's other things, but they don't measure up to the level of Love Fights. So I'm hopeful that Skeleton Key will. It doesn't have to measure up to it, but I'm hoping it's something that I enjoy, and it's something that has something to it that I really like. And I'm also curious because the artwork. The look of his art is different in this than it is in probably all the other stuff that I've read. So the final thing that I got at this dealer's table, and I was trying to get out of there without picking anything else up. Now this is something that I have not heard of, and I'm not sure where it's from, but the description sounded interesting. And this is a book called Avignon, Gods and Demons, and I just realized I thought it was Avignon, Gods and Demons, but no, it's Avagon. And Avagon is a robot or something like that. It says Avagon has to escape. Her mechanical world is killing her very soul. The sky is black with acrid smoke. The rivers run slick with oil, and bizarre clockwork creatures roam the streets. Above it all, eccentric, power-hungry politicians and egomaniacal clockwork masters govern with stone-cold hearts, but how can Avagon escape a surreal world of machines where she herself is one? And there's a little more description there, but I'm going to stop there. I like the look of the artwork. Actually, in a way, it kind of reminds me of Fred Chow's artwork. This is by Jimmy Robinson and Kay Gilson, or Che Gilson. I'm not sure which one it is. But I like the look of this. It's black and white. And so the cover has some color, but it looks like the book itself is all black and white with shading. But it looks interesting, so I'm looking forward to giving it a try. And I believe it's a complete story. I honestly didn't even look this up. I bought it basically based on what I read and what I saw in the book as I flipped through it. So that's everything that I bought from that one dealer's table. So I guess I should go on. After that, I had to rush upstairs, and I went to the first of two panels that I went to today. There was considerably less programming on Sunday than there was on Saturday, or even than on Friday, but certainly a lot less than on Saturday. Basically, it was just 2 rounds of programming, or 2.5, however you want to look at it. I mean, the earliest panels were started at noon. The show opened at 11. The earliest panels were at noon. And then there were some more panels like at 1:30. I think there was one more at 3 o'clock. But it was on the Marvel films, and I wasn't interested in going to that. So I just passed on it. So the first panel that I went to was Betty Brown, PhD. And I found out, I think I speculated on this in episode 164, whether PhD was a typo. Turns out it is not a typo. It is a designation which is no longer used for pharmacists to designate somebody who has finished pharmacy school, I think it would be. So Betty Brown was a comic strip that ran in a trade magazine called Drug Topics. And the presenter here was Tom Heinches, who does a magazine called Hogan's Alley, and I will talk about that a little bit more after I talk about the panel. Anyhow, he talked about the origins of Betty Brown. He called her the first educated woman comic strip? No, not educated. What did he say? Titled. I think that's what he said. Titled woman comic strip character. I think that's the way he put it. In other words, there had never been a female doctor or a female lawyer or anything like that, but Betty Brown was a PhD. He's not 100% certain that this is the case, but considering that this started in 1934, there's probably a pretty good chance that she is the first one. Tom talked about some of the people who worked on it. Apparently the strip originally started as one that featured a man named Bob Steele. And it was called Bob Steele PhD originally. And then they wrote Bob Steele out of the strip, and they brought in Betty Brown. And actually she first showed up as an unnamed character, and then Bob all of a sudden had to leave because somebody in his family got very ill, and so he left and Betty took over. Now, in this strip, there's kind of a rivalry between her and another pharmacist who's a man, and he looks down on her very much, and in large part because she is a woman. Tom talked about some of the artists that work in this, and there weren't that many. There was one named Zach Mosley, and there was another named Booty Rogers. And I think some of the people who were there were familiar with these with these artists. I am not very familiar with these artists. I'm not sure exactly who they are. But one of the things that Tom talked about was how they were basically probably part of the reason why they introduced Betty Brown and got rid of the original character Tom Steele is because they thought that the sex appeal, that most pharmacists are going to be men, and having a woman in there would help to sell the book, help to sell things to the readers. Okay, so their audience was pharmacists, and what they were hoping is that it's a trade publication, this Drug Topics, and so there would be ads for all sorts of things that from companies who were trying to sell things to pharmacists to stock in their pharmacies. And I suppose this is from a time that we don't really have that much of now, probably, and this didn't come up in the conversation, and I didn't think to ask this, but this is probably a time when you didn't have these big not necessarily multinational, but nationwide pharmacy chains. You probably had some regional ones, but you probably did not have national pharmacy chains. But I'm not certain on that. So the point being that the local pharmacist was probably more responsible for stocking the store than is the case today, when that sort of stuff is basically, well, I'm guessing now, is probably controlled more by somebody higher up and not the pharmacist himself or herself. Tom Heinz just talked a little bit about, some of the quirks of the strip, how the character changed, especially after Booty Rogers took over drawing it, and Booty liked to draw women as much more voluptuous, much more, there was a word that I was thinking of, voluptuous or glamorous, and that prior to that she was a little more plain in appearance. There was a character in the strip whose name is Ragtime, who is African American, who was drawn very caricatured, which means very, racially caricatured in a way that does not really look like a real person, but looks like a cartoon version, like something like Ebony White from the Spirit strip, as drawn by Will Eisner back in the day. Now, Heinz tried to emphasize that Ragtime was always treated as an equal in the strip. He was never, the way he spoke wasn't completely, he spoke with some broken English or some slang or some, I'm not sure what word to use here. He had an accent that was different from the accent that the other characters in the strip had. But Heinz emphasized, and he showed us a lot of samples of this strip, that Ragtime was I'm not sure if he was a fully realized character. I mean, he was not the focus of the strip. And this is something that's come up for me when I'm reading, Terry and the Pirates, with a character like Connie, Confucius. He is not a fully realized character. He is somebody who's basically there just to fill a role. And I think that's the case with a character, that's probably the case with a character like Ragtime. He helps to move the story along, but he doesn't really, unlike the main character, Betty Brown, and even Betty Brown probably is not a fully realized character. But, I'm getting into areas where I'm a little uncomfortable because I haven't read this strip. So I don't really know it that well. He didn't just talk about this strip, he also talked about professional women in comic strips, characters like Brenda Starr and Jane Arden, I guess ones who might have been either in comic strips or in comic books, and ones who came after Betty Brown. In talking about the Betty Brown strip, there was this hiatus because the artist at the time, Booty Rogers, was called up into I think it was the Army, but I'm not sure. Maybe it was the Navy. one of the armed forces during World War II, and so it went on hiatus for about 4 years, from 1942 to some point in 1946. At one point, the strip was weekly. It later went to bi-weekly, as in every other week. He talked a little bit about this other feature that would run, other kind of cartoon feature, which was kind of similar to Ripley's Believe It or Not, that was called It's a Fact. And he showed us some samples of that. And now looking at my notes, I can see that the first degreed female in comic books, or woman in comic books, that's what the way Tom Hines just described her. And the other thing that was interesting that he pointed out was he's amassed an archive of scans of this, because this, after all, this is not from a comic book, it's not even from a newspaper, it's from a trade magazine, but he was able to acquire access to copies of all these trade magazines from somebody who had them, but somebody who apparently wanted to remain anonymous, and so he wouldn't tell us who this person was. And I assume that person's name also does not appear in the article that he wrote about this character. So I think that's basically it for this panel on Betty Brown. I mean, I thought it was an interesting panel. I did go by Tom Hines' table later on after I went to the second panel, and he does this magazine called Hogan's Alley. He does it about once a month, about once a year. The latest one is issue 22, and he's been doing it since the early 90s, I think, or the mid-90s. I think he said 94 was the first year it was published. So obviously it's not one a year if he started in 94. So I went by his table and I talked to him about his strip, or not about his strip, about his magazine and about these sorts of things. I ended up buying a copy of this latest issue of Hogan's Alley, which has the article on Betty Brown. It's something I think my mother might be interested in. I'd at least like to show it to her and see what she thinks of it. I seriously doubt she ever saw it because, as far as I know, there were no pharmacists in the family. So I don't know how she would have gotten her hands on something like this. The second panel that I went to, which was wasn't immediately after, it was about a 15 or 20 minute wait, was the Charles Vess and Bill Sienkiewicz panel. Now this is the one which was originally scheduled for today, according to the website, and then in the program guide they'd moved it to Friday, and then they've eventually moved it back to Sunday. And I found out about that from Andy Mansell, who's the one who runs all the programming for Heroes Con and has for a number of years. So the Charles Vess and Bill Sienkiewicz. Oh, and before I went to that panel, I ran into Mike Myers and Bill Bomer again. I think they went to a different panel because when I found out that this panel was going to happen, I sent a tweet to Mike and he thanked me, and then I saw them after between the panels, but I didn't see them in the panel for Bill Sienkiewicz and Charles Vess. Now this panel ended up being not exactly what I expected. I remember going to another panel like this a few years ago, I think it was 2015, when they had a panel where two artists talked to one another. And in that case, it was Klaus Janson and Michel Fife. In that case, there was really more of a conversation going back and forth. In other words, they were both asking each other questions. In this case, it was almost like an interview, like Bill Sienkiewicz interviewing Charles Vess, because Sienkiewicz asked almost all the questions and Vess did almost all of the answering. And occasionally Sienkiewicz would throw something in about how he works and something like that. So it was a little disappointing in that regard, but it was still a very good conversation. I still enjoyed listening and watching them interact. Charles Vess brought some slides or a PowerPoint, I guess, presentation, which was just a bunch of photographs of things that he's done. Some of them were paintings, some of them were sculptures. There was a mural in there that he'd done, and he talked a little bit about how he'd done them, and they talked about process. And let's see, looking at my notes, they talked about influences. Oh, Vess told a funny story about Jim Starlin overhearing some comments that he'd made, or no, he overhearing Jim Starlin. He was coming down the hall, and Jim Starlin was around the corner saying something about, I don't know how this guy gets any work here, you know. And then Charles Vess walked around the corner. I don't remember exactly. I did tape this panel just like I taped the first panel today. So I don't remember exactly what the reaction was, but obviously it was a bit embarrassing for Starlin. Bill Sienkiewicz did talk a little bit about his origins. He talked about his interest in superheroes, some of the influences on him, Carmine Infantino, Neil Adams, some of the illustrators he was introduced to from art school and from museums. Charles Vess had pointed out that when he was younger, and I'm guessing he's in his late 50s, early 60s, somewhere around there. I don't remember clearly if he said anything that would have dated exactly how old he was. But I'm guessing he's probably late 50s, early 60s, maybe even mid 60s. I'm not certain. But he was saying that there were no art books when he was growing up. He grew up in a small town in Virginia. I believe he grew up in Lynchburg or near Lynchburg, which I passed through on my way to and from Heroes Con. But he said there were no art books, there was no museum, and it's all much different now, but back then, and of course there was no internet. You couldn't look things up. But they talked a little bit about, Vess mentioned how certain artists' work doesn't really speak to him, people like Boris Vallejo and Julie Bell and Frank Frazetta, and that sometimes he has trouble communicating. He's taught classes, including classes for people like them, to students who want to draw things like them, like Bell and Vallejo and Frazetta. And he quite often has a hard time getting certain things across to them because they see things in a way that is very much guided by the work that they've seen, I guess, from people like Vallejo and Bell and Frazetta. And if it isn't like that, if it isn't, it's kind of like sometimes you have to go through something. Sometimes you have to take a left turn to get to where sometimes you have to take an indirect route to get to where you need to go. And sometimes people have a hard time seeing it. That's kind of my read on what Vess was saying about these students. The other thing that he talked about a little bit was this book that he'd worked on with Ursula Le Guin before she died, doing illustrations for her book on the Earthsea books. I'm not terribly... Once again, I've taped this. If this interests you at all, keep an eye out for that, and hopefully I'll be releasing that at some point in the not-too-distant future. Bill Sienkiewicz did mention that he's working on a book with Kelly Sue DeConnick, a collection called Parisian White. And I don't remember exactly what that's about. Oh, and one of the interesting things they talked about was when they get commissions, somebody might pay them, say, $500 for a painting, but they really have no concept of what a $500 painting should look like and how much work they should put into a $500 painting. And so it becomes quite hard for them for both Sienkiewicz and Vess to kind of quantify these things, because they would take $500 to do a painting, and then by the time they're done with it, they feel it might be worth something more like $5,000. I thought that was an interesting. And there was some mention of a Marvel version of Prince Valiant, and I'm going to have to look that up because I didn't get a chance yet to look that up, but that interests me. I'm wondering if they were just if it was something else, if it wasn't Prince Valiant, but it was something that sounds like Prince Valiant, or something in the same flavor as Prince Valiant. Anyhow, that was basically it for that panel. It ran also about an hour. like I said, it was a fascinating conversation, although it wasn't exactly what I thought it would be. There certainly was considerably less about Sienkiewicz and his work. There were a few questions from the audience. I didn't really remember, and I didn't make any notes on any of them. And sometimes it was hard to really, it wasn't like they were following a narrative. It was like they were talking process, but they were kind of all over the place, and really the only thing that really grounded the conversation, I think, would have been Vess's slideshow of his various pieces of work. And so they kind of stuck with that for a while, but then eventually they got a little more out there. And I don't know, maybe if I was a different sort of person, it would have meant more to me, or it would have seemed more unified to me than it did. Anyhow, after this panel, I went downstairs to the show floor and I walked around again, and I stopped at a number of places. The first place I stopped was the Tomorrow's table. I had been there on Saturday and looked through a lot of their boxes. They had discounted issues of their magazines, copies of their magazines, and I bought one. I bought back issue number 73, which is on Batman's partners. And what interested me the most, although there's a number of these articles that sound interesting, is there's a article on Batman and the Outsiders, which is, let's see, how many pages? It's about 15 pages, 17 pages, something like that. And I mean, of course, there's images in there, so it's not 17 pages of text, but still. And yes, I could have gotten this from online, just gotten the PDF, but it was a beautiful, it is a beautiful issue, and I am in the midst of reading Batman and the Outsiders, and there's also a piece on Man-Bat, there's a piece on Commissioner Gordon, a piece on World's Finest, Nightwing, there's a piece on, I think it's Carrie Kelly. Yes, Carrie Kelly, the Robin from The Dark Knight Returns. The next place I stopped, well, I already talked about that, is Tom Heinz's table, Hogan's Alley. And I chatted with him for maybe 10, 15 minutes, something like that. And then I moved on. Right around the corner from him was Nikki Wheeler Nicholson, whose panel I went to on Friday about her grandfather and also Bill Finger. I didn't stay very long at her table, maybe 5 minutes. She had a book. I did look through it. It was a lot of comic strips that she had, that her grandfather, Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, wrote. He didn't illustrate them, and some of them she had shown pictures from at the panel on Friday. But she recommended that I join. There's a Facebook group for people who enjoy talking about these old comic books, and I think it's a fan group for Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson. And it's not a page, she said, it's a group. I struggled a bit after that. I was trying to find the Kirby Museum. And at first I took a quick look in the program guide and I couldn't find it, and so I just went to the information booth and I asked them, and they pointed me in the direction where it was, and they told me the booth number. So I went down there and I looked and I couldn't find it, and I think I walked right past it. But then I finally sat down and I pulled out the program guide and I looked through it until I found it in the program guide. And so then I found where it was supposed to be. So I went to that booth, but it was something completely different. It wasn't the Kirby Museum. So I asked the guy there, which booth number is this? And he was like, wait a minute, what are you looking for? And I told him I was looking for the Kirby Museum. And then he pointed me to where it was, and I had walked right past it like a minute before. I don't know why I didn't notice it. Maybe the display wasn't as good as it should have been. I'm not sure. Because when I got there, it was like, oh, duh, there's the Kirby Museum. There were all the big, because I wanted to see these big fold-out comic books that they had printed. I mean, these are huge. These are bigger than Treasury-size comics. These are like 2 feet tall and maybe a foot wide or something like that. I don't know the exact dimensions or even the ratio of the dimensions, but I mean, they're basically comic book the ratio, I'm sure, is just basically a comic book size. But they had like one of Thor, which I think is the one that they had the other day on Saturday at the All Hail Jack Kirby panel. And then there was another one for the Eternals and another one for, let's see, the New Gods. And there was something else there. Let's see, Thor, Eternals, New Gods. Yeah, there was something. Oh, it's on the tip of my tongue. And I can't think exactly what it is. I don't think it was Commandy, but it was something definitely cosmic focused. Yeah, I'm drawing a blank here. I said Eternals, didn't I? Anyhow, okay. Moving on. Oh, the one thing I did mention to Rand Hoppe, who is the curator, I guess, or the leader of, because I talked to him for maybe 5-7 minutes. I mentioned the presentation that I saw at the Appleseed Comic-Con, I think it was in 2015, that Kyle Latino did on Jack Kirby, which was very, I thought was very well put together. And so I recommended he look it up, and he looked it up on his cell phone, and he found it. I believe it's still available on YouTube. There may be links to it on my website from the episode where I talked about it, although at the moment I'm not sure exactly what that episode is. But I'm pretty sure that if you just Google Kyle Latino Jack Kirby or Jack Kirby Kyle Latino, you should find it on YouTube. As I recall, it was broken up into a few pieces, like each one was about 10 minutes, and there was about 4 or 5 of them that made up the whole of the presentation. And he does it with images, so it's his voice over all of these images of Jack Kirby telling a story, tracing things through Kirby's from Thor to from his older work, his work that he did about his own, that Kirby did about his own life, to some of his work on Thor, to the Eternals, to the Celestials. No, wait, not the Celestials. I guess the fourth world to the. Anyhow, it's a really good piece, and I know I talked about it before because I saw him give that presentation live, where he actually gave he showed us all the images that you'll find in the video on YouTube, and was, rather than play a recording of his spiel, he actually gave us the spiel. So anyway, after talking to Rand Hoppe of the Kirby Museum for a little while, I moved along. I walked around for a while. I eventually wound up at Dave Wachter's table. He's somebody I've bought things from a few times, although it's probably been a couple years since I bought anything from him. I stopped and chatted with him for maybe 5 or 10 minutes while he was drawing some sketch cards. He told me he had somebody who had asked him to draw Sasquatch. And when he got the request, he assumed that it was Sasquatch from Alpha Flight. But then after the guy left, he realized that he wasn't sure if it really was Sasquatch from Alpha Flight or it was the Sasquatch that this guy wanted on a sketch card. So he was kind of starting to work on both. He'd done them both, but he hadn't finished them both. He'd kind of done them rough so that he could finish up one or the other, or maybe he'll give the guy both cards. I don't know. Oh, and I stopped by the table of Chris Schweitzer and I snapped a picture of his Santa Claus display, which is just gorgeous. I bought these cards for my mother yesterday, but it would really take a real professional to cut them the way that Chris Schweitzer's cut them, and I wish I'd asked him exactly how he did that. Not that I think that I could any chance that I could do as nice a job as he did, because he really did a beautiful job cutting, and it's possible he got somebody else to do that for him. I don't know. I think the final place that I stopped was at David Pepos. I'm not sure how it's pronounced, and it's either George or Jorge Santiago's table. Actually, tables. I think they each had a table. They were right next to one another. And these are the guys who did the book called Spencer and Locke, which I just bought just the other day. It's a kind of what if Calvin and Hobbes grew up. In other words, what if from Calvin and Hobbes grew up and became a detective, and Hobbes is still there as part of his life. And it sounded interesting. He was on Word Balloon not too long ago talking about it. There was a mini-series. They did a mini-series. Now there's a second mini-series that's in the process of coming out. The first 3 issues out of 4 of that are coming out. And I think they have ideas for more things beyond that. And they don't just pull in things from Calvin and Hobbes, or they don't just pull in influences from Calvin and Hobbes, they pull in influences from other things. So they had a sale on it. I think the sale is over at this point. But I bought the first 4 issues, or the first mini-series for $1 an issue, or 99 cents an issue. And I'm looking forward to reading it, and hopefully I'll get to it sometime later this year, probably, considering all the other things I have to read. But it's the sort of thing that I could fit in between a couple other things. And I believe that's from Action Lab, is the one who printed it. And that's part of their adult line, or it's kind of, I heard him describing it to somebody as PG-13 rated. So it's not horrific violence, I don't think. But there is some violence, and there is some cursing. There isn't any nudity. So I'm curious to see what he does with this whole idea of what if Calvin grew up? What would Calvin be like as a detective? And so I told him, that I'd bought it, but I hadn't read it yet. And, so we talked a little bit about it, and he kind of gave me the sales pitch again, even though I wasn't about to buy it again. And that was basically it for my interactions with other people. I sat down. I did look around a little more for other stuff to buy. I didn't find anything else that interested me enough to shell out any more money. I did not walk the entire show floor this year. I walked a fair amount of it, but I did not walk all of it. I probably walked more than half of it. But I did not stop at every table. I did not stop at every booth. So I did sit down before I left and made some notes. I finished off my sandwich that I started to eat earlier. I looked through the things that I had bought once again. And then basically I took off around, I think it was 5 about the time I took off. The show was open until 6, but it was already clear by that point that people were starting to clear out. A lot of artists had packed up or were in the process of packing up, like David Pepos was packing up when I was talking to him. That's about it for the show itself. I went back to my car and drove back to the hotel, and then after just organizing things a little bit, I went out to get a bite to eat at this barbecue place, which the food was good. I really liked the food, but the service was slow. And I don't know if it's because it's Father's Day and the restaurant was pretty full, but it was definitely slow. And after I ordered, and after I'd gotten a beer, and I really didn't see anybody until people brought me something. And I did not keep track of how long it took me to get food, but it was definitely disappointing, the pace at which, and even then once I'd finished eating, nobody came to clean up what I'd done for quite a while. But I sat there watching some soccer. There's the CONCACAF Gold Cup. And actually I saw part of a game last night, Mexico and Cuba last night. I think Mexico won something like 7-0. And then I saw towards the, I didn't see the ending when I was at that Mexican restaurant last night, but tonight I did see the end of the game between Bahamas? Wait, no, not the Bahamas. Or was it the Bahamas? Somebody and, Haiti, yes. Haiti and, no, not the Bahamas, but, what's that island? Bermuda, I think. Was it Bermuda? Now I'm not sure. Once again, I could look this thing up, but I don't think I'm going to. So that's basically it for Heroes Con for this year. I'm basically done with the show. I'm sleeping the night here, and then I'm getting up early tomorrow and driving home, another 7.5, 8-hour drive home. I guess I'll get back to the D.C. area around 2:30, 3 o'clock if I'm lucky. And if I get out of here on time, I think they start serving breakfast downstairs at 6 o'clock, so I'll probably be down there first thing. And So I had a good time at Heroes Con. It did not seem as busy as it has in some other years. I'm not sure why that is. Now that I think about it, there were years when Stan Lee would come to Heroes Con, and I wonder if something like that would draw people. And I don't know, maybe it's comic book fatigue, with all these movies now that the last of the of this round of the Marvel films is over. Maybe it's not as big a draw as it once was. I guess these things kind of ebb and flow, and I don't know. So I think that's going to be it basically for Heroes Con. I guess I might record something about the trip home. I'm definitely seriously considering doing this again, and by that I mean driving down on Friday and then leaving on Monday. In some ways I'd like to even come down on Thursday and leave on Monday, but I don't know. That's an extra night. That's an extra night, in a hotel room, and I don't know if I really, that's an extra $100 or so, and then there's meals, and so it's probably $125 or more once you add all that up. I don't know if I really need all that. I think I'm very glad that I did not try to drive back today, because I can tell you by the time the show was over, I was pretty bushed. I did not want to do much of anything. I was glad to come back to the hotel and lay down for a minute. And my voice is cracking right now. And lay down for a minute. And take a breather, and then go out and get a bite to eat and not have to worry about being on the road for 8 hours. Because I can tell you the last few times I've come home from Heroes Con late at night, and I've done that basically every time except for the first Heroes Con that I went to when I left on Sunday morning. The last few wow, my voice is really going. The last few hours of that drive home are not fun at all, especially the second half, and the last 2 hours are just, ugh. I can't stand it. And so I'm very glad I'm not doing that. I think the trip home tomorrow shouldn't be too painful, hopefully. Knock on wood. And I think that's it for Heroes Con, basically. At least from Charlotte. If I make another recording, it will be from home. Before I wrap this episode up, I have a few more notes, a few more things that I wanted to mention. Follow up on things that I talked about during this episode. Okay, first, Jack Staff, Volume 1, which is Everything Used to Be in Black and White. I talked about this a little bit on episode 151 of the podcast, although I think I only talked about the last couple issues on that episode. Now, I do have notes at DaveTalksComics.net on all 12 issues in that initial run of Jack Staff. Number 2, Fred Chow. I mentioned that I bought a bunch of comic books from him at Comic Geek Speak Super Show in 2010. There was 8 trades that I bought from him, and these were the 8 trades. There was Last of the Independents, which was kind of an indie crime story, I believe. The Other Side, which is by Jason Aaron and is a Vietnam War story, which I found incredibly moving and really blew me away when I read it. Then there's Batman Secrets, which is by Sam Keith. I don't have any particular memories of that. I mean, I think it was probably good and probably worth reading, especially if you're a Sam Keith fan. I'm not sure if that's the only Sam. I know he's done some other Batman work, but I don't recall if I have any of the others or if I've read any of the others. City People Notebook by Will Eisner. I'm almost certain that I've read this, but I don't have any clear recollections of it. I love Will Eisner's stories of New York City when he was growing up, and some of them even stretch back further to before his time, but just the way he draws stories about ordinary people, I think, is just amazing. I did mention Mail Call by Milton Caniff, and that's a strip that he did. Milton Caniff, who was also the creator of Terry and the Pirates, and Steve Canyon. This was kind of something in between those two. I believe it originally began as kind of a spin-off out of Terry and the Pirates, but then it became its own thing after Terry and the Pirates, after his tenure on Terry and the Pirates ended in 1946, at the end of 1946, I believe. Then we have volumes 1 and 2 of Persepolis by, I believe it's Marjan Satrapi. This was a autobiographical comic, which I thought was, I enjoyed it quite a bit. I think I was much more moved by the first volume than the second volume, but it's an excellent piece of comic books, or it's an excellent illustration of what you can do, I think, with comic books. It's probably not everybody's thing, but I think it's one of those, I don't know if it's groundbreaking, but I think it's definitely something that a lot of people have related to, and it has gotten a lot, or did get a lot of press. I don't know if it's talked about as much. I believe there was a movie made of it. I think the movie was originally made in French. It's an animated film. I have not seen it. I really should seek this out and try and give it a watch. And then the last thing I got from Fred Chow was Hellboy Volume 3, The Chained Coffin and Other Stories. This is, I believe, the only collection, other than I've mentioned on the podcast that I read that initial Hellboy miniseries, whose name is escaping me at the moment. But this is, I believe, when Mignola was writing and drawing the book, and eventually he would hand over the drawing chores to other people, but I think for the most part he was the one writing the book. Okay, moving on. After that, we've got another note I have here is Eclipse Comics. So I bought 3 Eclipse comics, that Luger miniseries. I now have 12 comic books from Eclipse, but that 3 issues of Luger is about as cohesive a 3 issues as I have in that 12 comic books. In other words, these others are just all over the place. I'm not even sure how many of them I've read, but looking at my spreadsheet of all the comic books I own, like I said, just 12 issues. But I do plan to read this Luger miniseries. Skeleton Key, 1995. So this was the initial run of Skeleton Key. It ran for 30 issues. It was collected in 4 trades. I bought the first of those trades. There is also a second series that ran for just 4 issues, which was collected in a 5th trade. So there's 5 trades out there. I'm not sure if they're still in print, but when I look for them, I think they can be found for reasonable prices if you're interested in that sort of thing. During the Charles Vess and Bill Sienkiewicz panel, there was a mention of a Prince Valiant miniseries. I was completely unaware of this. So I looked it up and I found it. It was written by Charles Vess. There was somebody else who drew it. It was just 4 issues. I'm kind of curious now to check it out. It has not been reprinted, but I think it can be found for fairly reasonable prices if you're interested in that sort of thing. My recordings of the panels from this year did not come out great. In fact, some of them are pretty bad. And I think that's because of the audio in the rooms. There was no big problems like air conditioning units making all kinds of noise, but I think it's just, I mentioned when I was talking about the Legion of Superheroes panel, some of the people weren't sitting close to the microphone. I mean, that panel was a bit of a disaster anyway, and I think mostly it was because of I don't know, it just seemed like 2 of the participants didn't want to be there. That being, I'm not sure if any of the 3 wanted to be there. It really would have been a better panel if they'd gotten people there who actually wanted to talk about their time working on the Legion of Superheroes. But Joe Staten and Keith Giffen did not sit very close to the microphone. They did not talk very loud. It was not a celebration of the Legion of Superheroes. And I've kind of gotten off topic here because what I wanted to say was that most of these recordings did not come out. And yes, I could post these, but I don't know how audible they are. I have not listened through, I've sampled them, but I have not gone through and listened to them in their entirety. And I just don't see me releasing any of these recordings. Now, what I did get from Sunday was some inadvertent audio. And what I mean by that is that after I went to the panels, I didn't realize that I hadn't turned off my recorder. And so it was still recording as I walked around the floor. And so all the people I talked to on the floor after the panels, after, was it 2 o'clock or 2:30, something like that, I have recordings of our conversations, and they actually came out pretty good, or pretty clearly, at least. Let's put it that way. Now, I don't feel good posting those because I didn't ask their permission to record them, so I don't think I'm going to be posting those. I forgot to mention that I did buy a t-shirt. I like to get a t-shirt from the show, from Comic-Cons, and part of my reason for that is that these things are one-time sort of things. You know, you get a show from the 2019 show, they're going to have a show t-shirt next year, but it's going to be a completely different t-shirt. So these are kind of like snapshots in time. So they had a t-shirt which was of Usagi Yojimbo and Gru the Wanderer, drawn by Stan Sakai, and Sergio Aragonés, which is also the image. It's the same image that you see as the attached to this episode of Dave Talks Comics, attached to all the Heroes Con 2019 episodes of Dave Talks Comics. They had it on a gray and they had it on a yellow. I decided to get it on a yellow t-shirt. I liked it quite a bit. It was $20. I thought that was very reasonable, and I really like it. So that was the t-shirt that I got this year. I just have a couple other thoughts. The drive home was a little slower than I wanted it to be. Mostly that was the last 60 or so miles once I got close to home, because I hit the DC area at about 3 o'clock. Traffic was very heavy. So it took me about an hour and a half to drive the last 60 miles. A little slower than I wanted it to be. It was raining. And then it was pouring rain right when I got home. I mean, really coming down hard. I ended up sitting in the car for about 10 or 15 minutes until the rain let up. I don't think it completely stopped. And then my final thoughts is, you know, I had a fun time this year. I wish that the panels had turned out a little better. I mean, some of them were good. The only one that I think I would say was really great was the first panel I went to, really. The Cartoonist Kayfabe. I mean, that one was a lot of fun. Some of the others were interesting and informative. The Kirby panel was good. The Betty Brown panel was good. I'm trying to think of what the others that I went to were. Well, I think I've already said the Heroes, or not the Heroes, the Legion panel I wasn't too crazy about. The Sketch-Off panel was okay. The Inkers panel I enjoyed, although I completely screwed up and made an idiot out of myself in the middle of that panel, but it was fun. I think I've had enough of Mark Evanier at this point for a little while. I think probably my favorite panel with him was probably the panel he did with Marv Wolfman, where the two were just talking to one another about their careers and how they know one another and that stuff. I'm not sure if I need to see another Jack Kirby panel. The thing about the Kirby panel was that it was trying to cover his entire career, or at least how these people knew him. And I think I would prefer a panel that's much more focused, like Kirby's run on Thor, or Kirby's run on the Fantastic Four, or Kirby's work on Commandy, or something like that, rather than a panel that covers his entire career, or superpowers, or something completely much more focused. I have heard one on 2001, although I still have yet to read that. Anyhow, that's my thoughts on the panel. And the second panel that I went to on Sunday, the Vess and Sienkiewicz panel, it wasn't exactly what I wanted. It wasn't bad, it was good, but it didn't blow me away. Anyhow, so I'm probably going to go back to Heroes Con next year in 2020. This was my 7th Heroes Con, 7th in the past 9 years. I'm thinking about maybe not driving next year, maybe taking the train, or maybe flying. I'm not sure. It's going to be a little pricier than driving my own car down there. And then finally, I'd like to look and see how much I spent, and I spent about the same as I have in the last few years, maybe slightly less, My big purchase this year was, of course, that piece of art that I bought, the painting by Josh Greathouse. I spent considerably more on that than I did on comics. I only spent something like $40 on comics, whereas I spent over $200 on that. Let's put it that way. But it's a beautiful painting. I love it. I'd have no regrets about buying that. But that was the only piece of art that I got this year. So that does it for Heroes Con 2019. And that does it for this episode of Dave Talks Comics. This podcast can be found at davetalkscomics.com as well as on iTunes, Stitcher, and maybe SoundCloud if I ever get around to posting episodes there again. You can keep up with what I've currently been reading at davetalkscomics.net and what I've been watching at smallscreenscrawls.blogspot.com. I usually update those blogs on a daily or weekly basis. Links to Small Screen Scrolls can be found at davetalkscomics.com or davetalkscomics.net under the Other Blogs header on the right-hand side of the page. davetalkscomics.com for the cast, .net for the notes. If you have comments or questions, I can be reached at davetalkscomics@gmail.com, on Twitter at davetalkscomics, or leave a comment on my website. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening. ABCD. Dave Talks Comics.